Okay, the numbers appear to have stabilised, so we will kick off then. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on this lovely sunny Friday. And welcome to the Business Club, our May event, a webinar this lovely day on funding forecasts for 2021. And we've got a lovely group of panelists that are eager to have a discussion and a debate about the thorny topic and sometimes controversial topic, but we'll try not to be too controversial. It's a Friday after all, and almost a bank holiday. So just a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are recording this session because we will upload that to our YouTube and social media channels. If you have any questions for the panelists, please pop that into the Q&A box. If you have any technical issues, please pop those in the chat box, and my colleagues Lauren and Ben will do their best to help you out. Please do follow us on Twitter at Business Club, UOB Business Club, or on LinkedIn as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our panel chair this morning, Ruqaiya Malik, who's the Head of Strategic Projects and Partnerships at the University of Birmingham. Good morning, Ruqaiya. Lovely to see you. And our panelists this morning, Professor Tim Softly, who's the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Knowledge Transfer at the University of Birmingham, Dr. Joe Marshall, CEO of the National Centre for Universities and Business, and Eva Block, who's the West Midlands Regional Manager at Innovate UK. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much to the panellists. And now I'll hand over to Ruqaiya. Over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully this is going to be a scintillating session of 55 minutes of Q&A. As Kate has said, if you've got any questions, please do put it on the chat and we'll try and pick up as many as possible. Before we had questions, we did put together a handful of questions. So I'm going to go through those and invite our panel to answer some of the questions that are probably burning in some of your minds. So I'm going to kick off with the first one. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. So this question is to my colleague Tim Softly, and it is the ARIA agency will be funding high impact, high risk, high reward projects. Is this a positive step for research, funding and business, including HEI, obviously, in terms of collaboration?
Thank you, Ruqaiya. Good morning, everybody. I think the answer to your question is maybe. And of course, we don't actually know exactly what ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, is really going to be. So I'm going to just answer your question assuming what I think it should be. And I think the clue to that is in the title. It is the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. And of course, an invention is about devising or contriving or fabricating something new, a new instrument, a new process or something. And the government is thinking big here. If you read their documentation, they draw parallels with the invention of the steam engine, which of course is something very important to the local region here, the fuel cell, the internet, the GPS, and you could add to that the laser, the silicon chip, or MRI imaging, or mRNA vaccines, and so on. So they're thinking big, and they're thinking about inventing things that will solve major challenges for society and the country. So despite that, they're only putting 800 million into over a number of years, which is, and bearing in mind that the EPSRC Research Council budget in any 1 year is more than that, then I would say the money they're putting into it is minor. I think the key thing that I think this should be is about building on scientific discoveries. That's what most inventions do. I think it should start off with programs and projects that are quite low TRL level, probably TRL 1 or 2, and really, so that's really at the level of basic principles are being observed and some basic technology concepts established. But I think that this should be about programs that take those basic concepts through the development into something which might be an exciting invention. And as we know, sort of running through those TRL levels is not a linear process. It quite often involves you climbing one mountain, getting to the top and realize you don't like what you see over the other side, and going back to the drawing board or going back to the lab and actually having to develop the materials more, or to have different properties, for example, if it's a particular kind of device. And I think it's really in that kind of iterative process of development where the university, business, industry engagement works best and at its strongest. And therefore, I think universities have a very strong role to play in ARIA. I think this university, we already have good exemplars of that with, for example, our Quantum Technologies Hub, or with our High Temperature Research Centre, or our Healthcare Technologies Institute, where we're really working at trying to develop new products and technologies. So a lot of cooperative working, I think, in this between scientists based in universities and research institutes, with business, with SMEs, and supply chains. And I think the final thing I want to say is that no technology in itself solves the problems of society. There is the big question about adoption and social acceptability of new technologies, for example, like AI. And again, I think universities, given the breadth of a university like this one, which runs from engineering to the social sciences and humanities, we can really bring that breadth to bear on not only helping the inventions to come into place, but actually getting them adopted and designing them in the right way so that they will be adopted. I better stop there and let others have a word.
That's great, Tim. Thank you. I think you've captured some of the things that a lot of us are thinking, and especially around the areas of low TRL levels, especially the work that we do within the university around small, medium enterprises. They're quite keen to understand how they can have a bit of a play in this area. Eva, I'd like to follow on this question from Innovate UK's perspective. What do you think the role is for them?
I think that's a very good question, and to be honest, I would echo what Tim has said about the details being somewhat, still in the development. So obviously we can't have any sort of more specific views as of yet. However, it's a positive development, and the fact that ARIA will be focusing on sort of blue sky inventions and looking at the ground or the big challenges that we're facing at the moment, I think that's very positive. I think there's a clear role for us at UKRI and at Innovate to actually develop a complementary relationship with ARIA to help bring those inventions to the market. And I think that's what we will hopefully see emerging in terms of how that's going to shape. But certainly it strengthens our position as a sort of research superpower, and sort of focusing on the work that we're doing at UKRI and Innovate in terms of industry engagement and in terms of sort of involvement of businesses in earlier research and sort of thinking of the market relevance at an earlier stage. That's very positive.
Thank you, Eva. So moving on to the next question. So this is very much around the knowledge exchange framework, and if you're in the HE business, this has probably taken over your life for a number of years. But I've got this question for Joe. For our audience, Joe, could you succinctly explain to our business audience what this is and why is it important for them as well as universities?
Good question, and I could probably spend a good hour sort of getting into the minutiae of the knowledge exchange framework, or the KEF as it gets summarised. So the knowledge exchange framework at its simplest is a range of measures and metrics that have been brought together to sort of reflect the breadth of knowledge exchange activities that a university is doing. For those in the sort of detail of it, this isn't just about the number of spin-outs or the number of interactions that we count and the sort of money that comes into the university. The knowledge exchange framework tries to take a broad basket of measures of different types of activities that universities are broadly doing with external partners, be that commercial R&D through to civic and its kind of partnerships with sort of social enterprises and third sector organisations, it's kind of more charitable activities. I think at one level, the knowledge exchange framework is really important, and you would probably expect me to say this, for the universities and for the sector more generally, for two reasons. One, I think it allows the sector to be able to better understand where it is doing well and be able to talk about the full breadth of knowledge exchange activities. And the second point is it gives universities, or certainly those of us working in that knowledge exchange space, a complementary set of frameworks to the Teaching Excellence Framework, the TEF, and more importantly, the Research Excellence Framework, or the REF. And so suddenly this kind of third stream or third stream activities within universities, the sort of broader knowledge exchange, is starting to get a degree of parity with other activities. For businesses though, and I will be quite frank and quite blunt, another framework that encourages another language to develop, for those of us who can talk in the university side about what a REF is and a REF impact case study and what a 4-star and different, the wonderful world that we can fall into. Businesses can also have their own language and acronyms as well, so we're not all just guilty of this. But I do think there is a danger that the knowledge exchange framework as it's currently constituted is not particularly useful for a business to kind of go, oh, that's what Birmingham's good at, and that's what Warwick's good at, or that's what UCL is good at. It kind of gives you a sort of indication, and the team behind the knowledge exchange framework have been very keen to not fall into the same trap that the REF has got, which is league tables upon league tables upon league tables. But invariably there are mechanisms for measurement, and there's cluster analysis and all those sorts of things. What I do think though is that I think it's really important to start encouraging the universities to collect a lot more information about their different types of knowledge exchange activities. That information can then be reused, repurposed, and build into to paint a picture to businesses about, okay, that university is doing a lot of work with SMEs. Okay, we'll take that information. Oh, that university is doing a lot of work on kind of civic partnerships and civic relationships. Oh, okay, we can start to get a sense of the different things. But I think it's about, probably more importantly, that the universities are starting to gather this measures and metrics, and then it's how it can be used in other exercises and other tools.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe. Tim, from University of Birmingham's perspective, what do you think are some of the positives and the negatives around KEF? And in terms of the business community, what do you think that their interest should lie, or where it should lie?
Yeah, so for those of you who missed this, the results of the first KEF exercise were published a few weeks ago, and to some extent the publication of that first round of KEF results was quite a low key. Was quite low key in terms of the way the media and press picked it up. And one of the reasons why it was quite low key is it was the data was presented in a way that was quite difficult for the press to construct league tables. Although I hasten to add that by looking at the underlying data, we can, for example, know that our university was number one in in England in the category of local growth and regeneration. Which was something we tweeted about just this week. Yeah, it's quite hard to extract the real data, and of course it was actually based, the KEF outcomes were largely based on data that we had already supplied for the last 3 years to government, recording their activities in various categories. And it was actually too late for us to actually influence the results. It was literally a dipstick into the data that we had produced. I think in the future, so we are as universities already starting to think about how we can do better on some of these metrics. I think there's still some need for refinement of those metrics, because they tend to be input metrics rather than outcome metrics. income associated with various knowledge exchange activities. But if I may cheat in my answer to the question, there is another thing called the Knowledge Exchange Concordat, which has been introduced in parallel with the KEC, which has been introduced in parallel with the KEF. And this, rather than being a presentation of data relating to knowledge exchange, is an exercise in which we are being self-reflecting on the way we go about knowledge exchange, the way we partner with industry, the way we try to work with regional partners, and so on. And I think to some extent this will may have more impact on our industry business relationships, because it expects us to reflect on what we're doing well, what could we do better, and how, and then to produce an action plan for how we are actually going to do some of these things better. And I happen to think that we are very good, for example, with those university business relationships and partnerships, and we are very good with our regional engagement. However, there is more we can do. There's probably more that we can do to make it easier for small businesses to engage with us directly, to see us more as a kind of one-stop shop, and still make it easier to find the people they need to talk to. I think we do a lot in that space, but there's more we can do, for example. So I actually think the knowledge exchange concordat, through this, if we take this self-reflective process seriously, will actually lead to improving those mechanisms, improve the way that we go about developing contracts with business and so on, streamlining those sorts of processes, and so I think this will in time be of benefit. The KEF coupled with the KEC, I think will actually benefit those relationships.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. So I want to move the conversation along a little bit to funding, obviously, and national funding, and also what the government's thinking is, what they're hoping to achieve. So I will bring Joe and Tim into this conversation, but Eva, this one's for you. So a £250 million uplift in research funding was announced by the government. Will this make the UK a scientific superpower, or is there more to do on this?
It will contribute to making us a scientific superpower. That would be my sort of probably short and sweet answer to that, to be honest. It's obviously an announcement that comes on top of the allocation in 2020 budget of the 400 million. So it certainly looks a little bit better when you sort of add those figures. And obviously it will go some way to contributing to our collaborations within Horizon Europe. And as I'm sure the audience, your participants will know, Horizon 2020 and before that FP7 in particular have been traditionally programs where the UK absolutely excelled, and in many of the strands of the programs, and in particular sort of some of the research-led programs, but also the societal challenges. Traditionally, UK researchers and businesses have been performing very, very strongly, and have always been the preferred sort of partner of choice for collaborations across Europe. So it certainly helps from that point of view, because it provides some form of continuity in terms of our collaborations and relationships. Whether it goes far enough, I'll reserve that opinion and sort of wait for Tim and Joe to perhaps express their opinions on that. But it certainly reinforces that sort of continued commitment to funding international research and innovation, which is absolutely welcome.
Thank you, Eva. Joe, do you have an opinion?
I could throw a few. Kate was asking us not to be too provocative at this early on a Friday morning, but I mean, I'd echo all of the sentiment from Eva, which is, clearly the government is prioritising lots of the key sound bites that are coming out of the plan for growth, the sort of revamp of the industrial strategy, the commitments in certainly many of the Prime Minister and Chancellor's speeches are the desire for the UK to be a science superpower. I think if we are going to be a genuine science superpower of the sort of scale, okay, the size of populations are bigger, but there are a lot more noughts on the commitments being made in the US and in China. So we have to recognise that 250 million, it pales even on the kind of proportion of population and size of economy differences. You know, Biden has announced a 1.9 trillion, you know, stimulus package, of which innovation and R&D are a significant, you know, part of that. We are, you know, these numbers are eye-watering in the US. They are equally bewilderingly huge in China. 250 million is not that. And I think my more provocative comment would be, the government has made for the size of the UK economy, a really strong commitment last year to £22 billion of public spending to leverage private investment. And we did a big task force last year that really got into the detail of why that 22 billion is really important for industry. It sends out a really strong signal that this UK government wants to more than double the public investment in R&D. And from there, it will hope that that will crowd in and leverage private investment. So getting to the 22 billion is really important. Having a skirmish, which is what happened at Easter around this 250 million and who's going to pay for Horizon, really shouldn't be, you know, where the government needs to be getting distracted. You know, we need to be on the flight path and roadmap to at least getting to 22 billion, because the 22 billion is the catalyst to send out all the right signals to go to industry that the UK is serious about science, it's serious about research and innovation, and we all wait for the innovation strategy that is published, which is promised later this summer. But it's sending out those signals to industry that the UK wants to put in its money where its mouth is, and it wants to leverage it. And then I think, you know, we've you know, had a lot of press coverage around the Horizon piece. It felt to me that 250 million is still actually not really addressing two issues that the government has faced. One, who is going to pick up the tab for Horizon Europe? And two, it came at short on the heels of the cut in ODA funding, which both are just coming, you know, they're coming, part of the challenge is the cliff edge. We are just essentially saying we're shutting these things off overnight, and that's the problem. You know, obviously there's a whole set of signals about, you know, the government's contention to these areas, but I think ODA and Horizon are signals that we need to get past these. We need to be investing more into research, not less.
That's great, Joe, thank you. So Tim, from a HEI perspective, what do you think this message sends to us?
I have to admit that I smiled when I read that the government was saying that 250 million would make us help to make us a science superpower. But I actually, yeah, it was, as Joe says, it was really covering, you know, or rescuing us from the skirmish that was going on around who was going to pay for our association to Horizon Europe. I personally think that our association to Horizon Europe is very important in terms of us big. I think we are a science superpower, but becoming even more a science superpower. I think those international collaborations and the long period of trust and that we've built up with Europe around those collaborations has been key to our current status. And as a scientist, I've been personally involved in a number of networks funded by the EU, and in all of those networks that there've been SMEs as partners alongside the universities, and actually that's been one of the most effective ways that I've seen directly in terms of stimulating actually international collaborations between SMEs and universities in Europe. So I think it was good that they sorted out for the time being the Horizon Europe problem. The bigger question, as I think there was also indicated, is will the government deliver on its promise around increasing R&D investment from the current 14.9 billion to 22 billion. And yeah, and at the same time, will it deliver on its intention to make R&D funding increase to 2.4% of GDP? And if you look historically, governments don't have a very good track record of delivering on such long-term promises. So I think there's a question, that even though in the Queen's speech just a few weeks ago, the government re-emphasised its commitment to those targets by sort of around 2026, 2027. Of course, they may not be in government at that time. Who knows? But they re-emphasise the commitment. But from a university point of view, what does that actually mean? Some of us may jump to the conclusion that this is, that all this 50% extra spend on R&D is all going to pour into the Research Council budget, and I think we shouldn't be naive as to assume that. R&D is a much broader thing than just research that takes place in universities, and I think I actually think that Innovate UK will benefit quite a lot from those increases if they happen. I can see Ava smiling there. But I think they will, yeah, I think actually this university has a very strong record in winning Innovate UK funding in partnership with business, and I hope that will continue. I hope that I mean, it'll be interesting to see how the new chief executive of Innovate UK develops things there. And leads Innovate UK in a slightly different direction, perhaps. But I hope Innovate UK won't forget the important role that universities have played in the development of innovation in partnership with business. But I think the jury is out on well, the 250 million. We'll take that and say thank you very much. But the bigger question is around the 22 billion and what form that comes in.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Tim. Moving on, this is a question for Joe. In terms of the strategy for NCUB, what do you think the encouraging collaboration for the NCUB strategy is, and how does this tie into securing funding, either on a national or a local level?
Excellent. So I'll answer this in two parts. I think one level, so one of the roles that NCUB does is work often at kind of chair, chief exec level of big businesses with vice chancellors and pro vice chancellors, looking at those big strategic issues affecting, collaboration and UK PLC, and the role in particular that R&D will play in terms of meeting many of the ambitions that we have. But part of that is about, we did a major task force last year looking at the role that research could play in terms of meeting the government's ambitions. Lots of the things we've talked about already this morning, everything from the 2.4%, the 22 billion, ARIA, as it was probably talking about it last summer, ARPA. What are the modes, as that interface as well with government, what are the modes of funding mechanisms that will genuinely encourage R&D activity in business? The UK has, unfortunately, a long tail of businesses that don't do R&D. The sort of famous stat of, I think, 75% of all R&D in the UK is done by 200 companies, is indicative of the fact that we need to inspire, encourage, make it as easy as possible for businesses. And for us as an organisation, the 2.4%, obviously we wouldn't get into the sort of, what does this mean in terms of funding for universities and businesses, what types of funding, what funding mix. Actually, the really exciting bit about the 2.4% is this shifts the UK economy from about 1.6, 1.7 being spent as a proportion of GDP on R&D activity. Just getting to the OECD average of 2.4% will be transformational. Really, we want to be getting to 3%. Many of the world leading advanced knowledge economies are at 3.5, 4% of their GDP being spent on R&D. For us, that presents kind of provocation to universities and to businesses that the new normal, a very cliche expression, should be that we're all doing more R&D. And so actually all of the things that we should be trying to do is think about every business in all parts of the UK should be thinking more about R&D. The R&D tax relief consultation that finishes next week is all about what do we count as R&D, how do we encourage R&D. So we try and influence all of those different levers and make strategic and practical recommendations about how we encourage R&D. The second quick comment I would just then make is that NCUB tries to sort of experiment. It brings together universities and businesses. It looks at things like strength in places, RPIF, thinks about how it can encourage universities and businesses to work on these big schemes that are out there that universities and businesses should be working on. So it has that convening role, but it also experiments in terms of using digital technology. So we've got a harvesting tool, an innovation brokerage tool that harvests all the latest funding calls that are coming out, all of the research expertise that we can pull out from different public sources, pull all of that together into one place to make it easy as possible for a business of any size, but in particular SMEs, search a database, find out what the latest funding call in their area or expertise or facilities. But we then have digitally profiled recently 50,000 SMEs that we think are probably really interested in doing R&D and saying, here's a funding call that you may never have heard of. And here's a university that are working in this area of expertise. We think we should try and help you match make that. And so we're working with parts of Innovate UK, parts of UK ARIA to say, oh, how do we match you all together and say with this kind of connecting piece? But it throws up some really interesting things about which businesses are doing R&D, which businesses aren't, what impacts an Innovate UK award had or not on terms of different cohorts. So we try to be a bit experimental. We try to make those connections, and that tool is specifically aimed at SMEs, but we know some of the big businesses, and some of them are on the call today. We'll use that tool just to find out what businesses, what universities are up to, what funding calls are coming out, what facilities and equipment are there. And so we use it to showcase, but this part of a broader piece of work that NCUB tries to showcase the opportunities to do more R&D and encourage businesses and universities and government that we should all be doing more of it.
That's great. Thank you, Joe. Eva, do you have any comments on what Joe has just talked about?
I do, in part actually echoing Joe's point about perhaps just sort of R&D being, as difficult as it is at the moment, and we see that on a daily basis with businesses struggling with the impact of COVID, impact of Brexit, and in particular at the moment, just sort of thinking about what's in the future, how do we grow out of it and sort of enhance our opportunities on the market. It's a difficult position to be in, but there is an absolute key role for research and innovation in that recovery. You cannot recover if you just continue doing the same types of things that you've always done. The market conditions change, the challenges have changed. We've got international challenges of net zero in particular, COVID recovery, health challenges, and security, sort of resilience, whether it's climate resilience or sort of digital resilience. So these are some of the challenges where you just can't tackle it without the research. And that's where, University of Birmingham, and Tim has mentioned that, has got a long legacy of collaboration with industry. And I would certainly also echo that comment of wanting to see more of that. You're doing well, and so please do more of what you're doing well, because you're quite good at engaging with industry. We just need to see a little bit more of that in terms of not just the businesses that perhaps come and have a clear idea of how to approach innovation, but those businesses that actually struggle with just what innovation is to start with. For a lot of them, it's a fight for survival, and it's perhaps turning it into a road to recover and pivot and sort of position yourself on the market in the future. One other point which I wanted to just sort of refer to in that context is the knowledge transfer activities. It's the KTPs that really play a key role in helping businesses see those opportunities. You know, it's a long way to kind of understand how innovation can really change your bottom line, and it starts from small steps. Joe, you've mentioned briefly the sort of the funding calls and the preparation. I've always been a great advocate of the early intel and preparation, because a great majority of businesses, and in particular those that haven't engaged with Innovator UK ARIA before, will simply not know how to approach a funding call, and so it's quite important to take advantage of opportunities to engage, to kind of understand what those calls might mean. And I know the university has got a very strong you know, department dealing with that, where obviously, you know, we're part of the event now, and that's a key role to play, you know, and we appreciate it as well within Innovate, that we need to do more in terms of kind of that familiarization of businesses with what innovation actually means on a day-to-day basis. So, and I'll just finish on one last point, and I'll stop then. Something just to kind of think about perhaps in the future, how to anchor innovation and R&D in local areas, because I think that's quite important as well, to kind of think about how the research strengths that we've got regionally, how they may contribute to building stronger economy locally as well, and stronger supply chains.
Thank you, Emma. I echo that as well. It's something that we really need to strive towards. I've noticed on our Q&A chat, we've got a few questions which I will direct to the panel members. So I'll take the first question, which is, how do we see the landscape for industry funding, especially for SMEs, brackets innovation and collaboration, with the new direction of Innovate UK and the end of ERDF funding? Can I pose that question to Emma first? And then I'll ask Joe and Tim.
I would say we don't necessarily at Innovate have a completely new direction. You know, we have a new CEO, and that's I'm sure he will bring lots of ideas and lots of ways in terms of how we ought to be engaging with industry, and sort of emphasizing our role as sort of thought thinkers, or thought sort of inspire us in terms of innovation and how to stimulate it nationally. There is certainly quite a lot for us to do in terms of focusing on commercialization, looking at skills, for example, looking at elements where perhaps we haven't featured very strongly in the past. In terms of sort of follow up from ERDF, I think the details on SPF are still in development, so to speak. So that's again something that perhaps time will tell a bit more in terms of what's the future. But certainly from our point of view, that renewed focus on you know, the key challenges which I've mentioned in my previous elaboration on around net zero, around cybersecurity, resilience, healthy aging, but also kind of looking at place and future of places, future of transport, building communities. So the role of innovation and research in the context of that will be, I feel, quite important.
Thank you, Eva. Joe, did you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, I've sort of said some comments already. I think the commitments that government is making at one level are, you know, need to be seen in the context of trying to increase public investment in R&D. What we do need to remember, though, is that to get to the 2.4%, it's the multipliers. We will need per year to be generating something like £17.5 billion of R&D from private investment by 2027. That is a significant extra per year increase of private investment of R&D. So all of the mechanisms that are being developed need to be ultimately pushed towards encouraging, but not sometimes not indirectly rather than directly. It's not all about match funding. You know, it is about having that pipeline of fundamental research at the lower TRLs that can then be exploited further down. So and one of the things we will always advocate is that it should be about investing in research and development. The UK has traditionally not invested in development, and I'm sure colleagues at Innovate will probably, you know, talk a lot about the fact that their budgets are not significant, you know, are not big enough relative to the size of others parts of UKRI. But that shouldn't be that that's not an argument that Innovate is making to take money off research councils. It's saying actually we need to raise, you know, the investment in D as well as in R. But I think I do think we are, the other thing that NCEB is looking at the moment is we are a bit worried about the fall off. Everybody has got quite animated about Horizon Europe and the costs of association with Horizon Europe. There will be a big fall off next year of ERDF funding, and in many parts of the UK that has played a really important role in the same way that KTPs do. It's a really good starting point for building those relationships between those businesses that have never done R&D before. Here's a way to get into the university, maybe it's KTP, maybe it's through an ERDF project. Suddenly that fall off of ERDF funding potentially next year, the signals that we're hearing from government is that the Shared Prosperity Fund is not going to be a like-for-like replacement. It's unlikely to have in the Shared Prosperity Fund the same level of focus on research and innovation type activities and initiatives. So, you know, for big parts of the UK where ERDF has played a really critical role, which is what it was designed to do, there's another cliff edge coming. And in big parts of the UK, especially outside of the sort of southeast, the ERDF is a really, really important mechanism. So something that we're in, you know, watching. We're watching brief and starting to do some analysis on. So.
Absolutely, Joe, thank you. Before I pass the question on to Tim, I'd just like to echo that from an operational level, my team manage a number of ERDF projects, and we're still negotiating a further few more. And for us, what we want to be hearing from companies, SMEs, businesses, is what your thoughts are. And currently, I know there's a survey that has gone out to quite a lot of businesses in the West Midlands region to try and tease some of those development ideas out of you. What we want to be prepared for, whatever the guise the Shared Prosperity Fund looks like, we want to be in a position in the West Midlands where we can respond to that call. We've just recently completed the Community Renewal Fund, which is the pilot programme and a precursor to Shared Prosperity Fund, and we've tried to grapple with some of the processes around that. So hopefully as a university ourselves, we will be contributing to some of the administrative processes and more importantly the local strategic priorities in order to understand how we can support the region by working collaboratively with our businesses. So I think watch this space for University of Birmingham from a very operational level. Tim, question over to you.
Just only briefly to add, just although Innovate UK and ERDF are very important in terms of industry funding for R&D, there are other sources, particularly I'm thinking of some of the scientific research councils, the EPSRC, Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council, which also provide funding, particularly for collaborative research and development between universities and business. And so there are opportunities there. And I would say, yeah, wearing my hat as a member of the EPSRC Strategic Advisory Network, I also think there are great opportunities for business to influence the funding mechanisms and directions of EPSRC. It probably doesn't get enough of that, or tends to get it mainly from large industry and not enough from SMEs. But I think there are opportunities there. I think in the future, the likes of EPSRC and MRC need to be more agile in terms of those funding mechanisms in order to really get the fruits of business university collaboration, because when business is ready to commit to that partnership, they want to get on with it. They don't want to wait 6 months for someone to review the application and come to a decision about it.
Absolutely, Tim, thank you. Next question from the Q&A is, with the new innovation strategy, does the panel believe government will devolve innovation funding to regions, for example, through the headlined innovation deals? And will these be at a scale that will make it worthwhile? And what would this need to be? Oh, I don't know who to pose that question to. So anybody, Joe, Ewa or Tim?
Shall I just make a start? I mean, I think it may do, although my concerns about government just simply handing over to regions large chunks of money to invest in innovation is the question of how well regions are actually set up to do that. To actually make those decisions about where to wisely invest their money in innovation. And I happen to be a member of the West Midlands Combined Authority Innovation Board, but I think we're still kind of developing those mechanisms, and I think it would be better if those mechanisms were developed in partnership with Innovate UK or in partnership with UKRI, rather than just giving them no disrespect to the West Midlands Combined Authority, but just simply handing the money over and saying spend it on innovation. I don't think regions are yet set up in ways that they would necessarily spend that wisely. That's my honest view.
All I can add to that, Tim, and thank you for stepping in, because I was just sort of considering how to respond to that. Obviously, it's still quite early days, to be honest. The details on innovation deals are somewhat, in development, alongside other things. I think we certainly stand ready to work and work very closely with regional organizations, and in my own context, obviously the West Midlands Combined Authority, and as you say, it's sort of a question of capacity and capability versus actually just that risk of not siloing yourself as a region to sort of end up competing with yourself rather than seeing the bigger picture nationally. So I appreciate that different opinions, and that's absolutely right that we have a discussion about that. But yeah, let's look forward to more details emerging.
And just to very quickly jump in, I mean, I think the government has made a lot politically about what it means. Well, it's a bit like the science superpower. They've talked a lot about levelling up without necessarily defining what levelling up means or what it looks like. You can't disagree with the sentiment that they are trying to bring more money, more opportunities to all parts of the UK. That doesn't necessarily mean, I think, to pick up on Tim's point, that each individual area then has autonomy and self-determination in just on its own. I think the UK is probably the Andrew Whitty review from a few years ago. We ended up doing some work with Innovate UK and the KTN and a few others, looking at local enterprise partnerships and the sort of role of research and innovation and the smart specialisation hub that we worked on. Part of the challenge, I think, was that you had lots of local decision makers saying, we want a digital hub, a life sciences cluster, and then you get 38, or as it was started off, 39 LEPs, all having exactly the same. Whereas actually what you really want is to say, Birmingham has world-leading research in an element of rail research technology that could really complement other research in rail technology. And so how do you genuinely create hubs and spokes across the UK that are achieving this kind of broader levelling up agenda? But it's therefore, Birmingham, Glasgow, Belfast doesn't want to be just given money and patted on the head and do nice things. It wants to be world leading because it is world leading and could be even more world leading if we could help join the dots up. That's the bit that's really exciting. And I think people like Neil O'Brien and others within government are trying to explore, what does levelling up really mean? And how do we achieve it? And how do we achieve it within the innovation strategy? How do we achieve this within the places strategy? How do we achieve this with the plan for growth? How do we join these government strategies up together?
I think there is, sorry, Tim. I think there is another element as well, which, and Joe, you're completely right in terms of, you know, how that thinking is progressing and developing at the moment. I think there is another element as well, which I saw one of the questions posted in the Q&A, is about how to bring in a bit more private investment. And it's not a very straightforward answer at all, because it's not just about throwing more money at people and then hoping that they will contribute more. It's sort of stimulating the right areas of research and innovation activity, you know, thinking about FDI, thinking about, you know, more equity funding, and sort of stimulating that as well. So there's lots of different elements that need to come into play, not just sort of, you know, hoping that businesses will contribute to that, but also, you know, we touched on that, the fact that research organizations have got an absolutely key role in stimulating that research and innovation capability with businesses, because they are working with local businesses, they work with local areas and sort of, you know, the likes of labs and combined authorities. They know exactly what the strengths locally are. I think the big challenge is to sort of have ways of turning those strengths into economic opportunities and economic impact. That's quite important.
Thank you. That's great. That's answered the question about the private sector likely to provide additional funding. Joe, you talked quite a lot about, not necessarily about the money. So there's a question on our chat, which is around the how, especially given that, as we talked about development, it can take months and years. There's a question on there, can the panel suggest ways to make the system more agile to take those things into consideration?
I mean, Tim's alluded to this. One thing, I think the funding mechanisms currently, you've either got effectively the danger of the £22 billion is we effectively just scale up everything that we're doing now and trying to do exactly the same as we're trying to do at 22 billion. And I think two things will happen. Is one, I don't think the systems that we've currently got are particularly agile. I don't think they are particularly responsive. And I think, therefore, they will quickly fall over, or we will miss the opportunities. They are some of them quite sometimes deliberately so clunky. You know, they're deliberately very peer review, very long processes to go through. That's fine if you are talking about, you know, we still need that. But if you are genuinely wanting to engage with industry and, more importantly, maximize these opportunities, we have a moment to be world leading at quantum. We don't have a moment to develop a 10-year strategy to think about how we become great at quantum or something like that. We've got to go, and we've got to go now. We've also got to recognize how the pace of business works. If we are asking, you know, certainly we've heard informally things like RPIF, some of the industrial strategy challenge funds are only possible if you work at the same timescales that businesses can go through in terms of their business approval. If you are looking for a 7-figure approval figure from a multinational corporation, they can't turn that round against a 3-week deadline from UKRI. You've got to be able to, sometimes that's just been a kind of cyclical part of challenge of some of the challenge programs. But I do think we need to sort of work alongside some of the business timelines to be able to be genuinely responsive and agile to those things, because you know, and work with business, not just go, oh, well, you know, you'll support this because you're a big business and you've always done it. And then that's the other part of agile, is let's put the user at the center of this, that user-centered design. How do we get those genuine business input into how we design these things, not just go, oh, it's really world-leading research, therefore businesses will like it. Sometimes that works, but sometimes we need to sort of think about different horses for different courses.
Thank you, Joe. We're running out of time, so I'm going to take one final question from the Q&A. So this question, Joe, Eva or Tim, over to you, is how do the panel view the future of international collaboration, particularly as tensions appear to increase, particularly with China? as evidenced by the formation of the government's new dedicated team, RCAT, Research Collaboration Advice Team, to advise on security-related topics.
Can I just jump in and say, I think international collaboration is vital in the future, but obviously we're very aware that we need to go into that with our eyes open, as it were, and the current mood of government is to be suspicious of some of our partnerships and what the end results of those, and we have to approach those in a way which is not naive and anticipates and does the appropriate due diligence on our partners. But we mustn't give up on international collaboration, because I think the future of this planet depends on it.
Thank you, Tim. Joe or Ira?
Just echo everything that Tim's just said. I think we need to be open. I think we need to be collaborative, and I think we need some of the grandest challenges the world faces will require us all to work together. I think I think naive is probably the right word that Tim used. I think we need to just make sure that we enter into those partnerships and relationships and collaborations with our eyes open, and recognise, that we've done our due diligence and not just sleepwalk into those things and see IP and other things slip away.
I can only echo what the two gentlemen said. I think what's really important is to continue our international cooperations and collaborations and relationships. We've got brilliant reputation, as we've discussed this morning, and that certainly is a key to solving some of those international challenges.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, everybody. We have now come to the end of our session, and I will just hand over to Kate Jeremy to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists for a really, really interesting last hour on the funding forecast. We haven't managed to get to everybody's questions. Apologies. There was a last question around the realistic nature of private sector adding to provide additional funding. So that's, I'm sure we could have a whole hour on that subject itself, the affordability of some of the innovation programs for for SMEs. But that's why the universities and Innovate UK exist. They are here to support businesses, and there are lots of schemes around there that have minimal funding contribution to business, and some of it is match in terms of time rather than cash. So it's always worth keeping an eye on what is around there and talking to the regional bodies, the national bodies like Innovate UK and NCUB, to find what the best fit is for your business, your program, your partnership. So I just want to say thank you very much, and the postman's just knocked on the door, which is really quite timely, but just to say thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you so much to the audience for participating in this morning's discussion, and I just want to say thank you very much, and we will wrap up here, and we'll hopefully see you at another event shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good bank holiday weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.